probably the Western understanding about Chinese is all based on the coastal or eastern cities. Yeah, but of course, some other people have written about Tibet, Xinjiang, or Yunnan, but those are all quite unique cases. So probably we should know more about those in the inland, in the middle, smaller cities, smaller inland cities.
We're missing the
those.
middle.
Yeah.
Pretty big middle.
Yes.
It's a nearly billion people middle, so it's not a small middle.
Yeah.
Actually, not too.
Yeah.
So let's not forget to get out there in cities that are off the map. You've done a whole podcast, Caitlin, called The DNA of Cities, of a big global cities, at least 12 of them thus far. I've just finished up a book on how to build a global city. Feel a bit on the spot here.
But in this episode, we're saying move over Shanghai and move over Beijing. It's all about the small cities now.
But I also think we're going to get stuck in the middle of the big cities with some billionaire villages and their urban villages and the enterprise speculation that props it all up. So, bit of a wild ride with Shenjing He. Ni hao, I'm Michele Acuto.
And I'm Caitlin Morrissey. And in this episode, we are talking entrepreneurship, the enterprising self, and Chinese urbanism.
Welcome to the mini-series Walking the City With, hosted by the Urban Studies podcast. This is a series all about the people behind the ideas in urban research. We really get them out of the lecture rooms, their books, their articles, and we walk the talk with these authors and editors in urban studies.
And to be clear, we're literally out in the city on a walk with these authors. And it's a special podcast because it's the world's first for urbanists. It's a peer-reviewed podcast, so you know the content must be good. So, Michele, who are you out with this time?
So this time I'm going into a dog park in Sydney with Shenjing He, who's Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Hong Kong. She has more prizes and awards for papers that we could fit in 30 minutes of an episode. But to give you a sense of where she's coming from here, she's been the editor of Urban Studies for 12 years now, and her work tackles urban redevelopment, gentrification, entrepreneurialism, the rural-urban migration, especially in China. So expect a bit of a wild ride and a trip out there in Chinese urbanism with Shenjing.
So how did Shenjing get into urban studies?
Well, let's hear it straight from her. In a loud dog park, amidst canine chants and noisy dog dads. What I think might stand out here, like in other episodes to be fair, is the personal journey that a walking the talk in urban research really leads us to, as a bit of a personal reflection. But however, I also found it interesting that prodding specifically on questions of global urbanism with our interviewees, like with Shenjing, makes us question what urban studies itself is today.
Well, I studied geography in my undergraduate, but at grade 3, we got to choose a different subject. So I chose urban planning. So naturally, I got interested in urban issues that related to planning and also modern planning, because I did study some general issues about geography, including physical geography. So I actually thankful for that, because that gave me a more broader view to look at urban issues by positioning cities into the regional context and look at things at different scales. Yeah, so...
And because you edit a thing called Urban Studies, what do you mean by urban studies?
Well,
I knew nothing about it.
What is urban? That is a good question. So it could be studies about city, for the city, and of the city, right?
You prepared this one.
No.
That looked very well prepared.
No, that is
good.
what I saw, yeah.
So Shenjing had a super polished answer there, but we really wanted to walk out authors out of the comfort zone in these episodes. So in agreement with Caitlin, that is here with me back in studio, I really tried back then to go deeper with her in what it means to study Chinese urbanism in the context of global urbanism. And Chinese urbanism, for some of us out of that scholarly context, I guess not walking the streets of Tianjin or Shenzhen might seem hugely complex, hugely ungraspable. So I asked Shenjing right away there in the dog park, how did she cope with, to quote her work, the relentless urban expansion of China? And how did this sit in global urban discourses more generally? The answer, be ready, might surprise you.
Chinese urbanism is not that different from other countries, I would say, although China is a vast country. But the approach that how I unpack urban issues in China is really from the ground. So I don't really look at the nation in its entirety. I usually use one particular urban issues or one particular city as an entry point to trying to make sense of a bigger issue. So we can start from a small issues, and then when the research unfolded, we can actually trying to understand broader issues by making the connections with the regional and national contexts. Another way to put it is try to avoid this China exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. Just think about the process of urbanization as a very general and not universal, but general processes. But in China, things just happening in a much faster pace, and it's like time-space compression, right? So when you look at the urbanization history in China, you are actually trying to compress what happened in the US, for example, in 100 years into 1 decade. So that's all.
Let me ask you about the concept specifically. I know it's sort of common in more sort of Chinese studies and China studies in itself, but it's the idea of the village in the city. And so you've talked about, first of all, if you don't mind explaining for anyone that has never come across this, the idea that there are villages in the cities in the Chinese reality is interesting. So if you don't mind, just can I ask what that is? But I think I'm interested because you talked about the re-urbanization of villages in the city. So what does that mean practically?
Well, village in the city, it might be unique to China, but if you look at other developing countries, you have seen favelas in Brazil, you have seen slums in India, etc. So it's not that different. But of course, urban villages in China, it's more economically viable and also more, it also provides a livelihood for the migrants from the rural areas. So it's part of the relentless urbanization process we mentioned earlier. So basically, it's the product of this compressed urbanization because the urban government refused to truly urbanize those villages because it's too costly to compensate their housing, to provide the citizenship and also the social welfare associated with the citizenship. So that was the main reasons for the emergence of urban villages. So now the government actually has entered a dilemma because they don't have any further land for urban expansion. So they are now in a stage that need to re-urbanize or infilling urbanization. So they have to demolish part of those low-rise houses in the villages and then modernize them into high-rises building or more urbanized built-up areas similar to other parts of the city. So that's what I mean by re-urbanization. And also another thing is the citizenship issue. Yeah, previously many villages, although they physically live inside the city, but they were not granted the equal citizenship as others living around that area. So this is something that they need to deal with. But it doesn't mean that the villages are, in a very poor or deprived situation. In fact, many of them are super rich because instead of planting grants, they are actually planting houses for rent. Yeah.
Back in the studio for a second, I quite like how Shenjing takes something so enormous like Chinese urbanization, so baffling and complex for an outsider, but we ended up on such a contained and specific reality like an urban village that contains these super rich residents. What do you think?
I think this is fascinating, and it really connects with some of Shenjing's influential research on entrepreneurialism and of course her work on the enterprising self.
Which comes next, I guess.
So previously, my studies mainly employing a political economy perspective or a more structuralist approach. For this enterprising self, it's more from a governmentality perspective, because it was discoveries through my fieldwork in China by talking to a lot of middle-class parents and middle-class homeowners. So I really find this enterprising self-spirit, entrepreneurship spirit in them. And they are very optimistic about their future, and also they actually unconsciously link their property values and their investment, their personal career development, and their children's future with the future of the urban development. So they are very confident in it because they also invest their lifelong saving into the property, and they see the urban development as a huge project, and they themselves are part of it. They would see themselves as a shareholder of this bigger investment, as the bigger enterprise. So it was quite amazed. I was quite amazed by that. So I was searched the literature and found that enterprising self is actually a quite compelling concept to link this individual positionality with the discourse trying to indoctrinate it by the state, by the government, to convince everyone to participate in this pro-growth entrepreneur project as a whole in the cities. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that then in the more recent work that you did on the speculative city, you go a bit more skeptical of that? I think I sort of read a bit more, not skepticism, sort of healthy critical stance on it and saying, oh, but it's underpinned by a massive degree of speculation. What's the speculative city there?
So I was trying to understand the behavior and also the mentality of the middle class, but they're only part of the story, right? So I also concerned about inequality. So 10 years ago, I did a project on urban poverty in China. So I see both sides of it. So that's why I do not think this shareholding mechanism trying to get middle class involved in the urban development project is a healthy and sustainable thing. So we have to take into account the lower income population as well, because we only see the successful story of those middle class investors, but oftentimes we neglected the sad stories that has been shouldered by the lower income populations. So that's why in the speculative city project, with other colleagues, I tried to unpack this, the both sides of this story, the both sides of the coin, to offer a more comprehensive story of the urban, relentless urban development story in China. Yeah, and also I'm trying to sending out a message saying that this may not be sustainable and also not equitable. And also we should raise the attention of policymakers in China to make them aware of the possible consequences of that. Yeah, even the investment in mega projects, etc., itself is not sustainable financially, because many Chinese cities is developing based on debts rather than real production. So a lot of cities already bearing 100% of the debts. It's going up quite rapidly, so it's really alarming.
So it sounds like Shenjing is saying that urban development projects in China could possibly benefit from prioritizing both middle-income and low-income populations, as well as middle-class investors.
Yeah, and I think it also couches it in a reality of a massive economic downturn and the struggles beyond the villages and beyond the billionaires of Chinese urban development.
Speaking of, did you get a chance to ask Shenjing about her thoughts on the state of urbanization in China today, or her thoughts about urbanization in China over the coming years?
Yeah, I had to sort of jump in. China's so much in the headlines and so interesting for so many that I thought, pardon the pun, that I could ask her to speculate a bit on Chinese urbanism and tell us what's next on the horizon.
A tough decade, I would predict. Yeah, because the entire real estate industry is really in a downturn, and the economic downturn is so obvious everywhere, including China. So it's going to be tough. So basically, the government has trying to change their strategy. So urban expansion basically has been banned, and they are now focused on redevelopment, particularly the urban villages I mentioned earlier, because those are the real potential is, yeah. If you look at the density and also the building height, so they are probably the only way that the land finance can sustain. So they are now casting their gaze at those urban villages, trying to redevelop them. But of course, it is going to be very high cost, very costly, because the compensation the villages are asking for is huge. Yeah, because of the location and also because of the scarcity of land. Yeah.
So do you have good hopes, bad hopes, no hopes for the villages? Where does the voice of the urban villages end?
Well, I don't worry about the villages because they are already multiple millionaires. As I mentioned earlier, they actually earn a huge profit by building houses and then renting them out. But I worry about the migrants, yeah, the renters.
In each episode in this podcast, we take the opportunity to travel globally with our urban studies scholars to places that have been significant to them over their careers and their lives more generally. The act of walking and moving together while imagining and discussing somewhere else creates a sort of multidimensional experience of the urban. And so, Michele, where did Shenjing transport you to while you were out and about?
She took us originally to Nanjing, and it was a interesting sort of bittersweet reflection on her own self. There's a lot of biographical in there as well, and I guess a really personal reflection as well on the limelight of popular Chinese case studies and what are popular Chinese reference points, and also a very interesting comment on the Eastern bias that Chinese urbanism might have, at least in Anglophone urban studies. Should we go and listen to Shenjing?
Let's do it.
Perhaps I would take you back to the starting point of my career as a urban researcher, which is Nanjing, where I did my undergraduate and master degree. Yeah, Nanjing is a city that always living in the shadow of Shanghai. Many people know Shanghai, but they don't know Nanjing. But Nanjing has been the capital for China for more than 10 dynasties. Yeah, so is called 平市街. It's an ordinary old urban areas right in the center of Nanjing. It's probably one of the poorest neighborhoods I visited, and I did interviews and questionnaire survey more than 20 years ago. I forgot about the history of this particular neighborhood, but at the time when I visited there are mainly the homes for migrants, for some laid-off socialist workers who lost their job in the 1990s. And all the middle class have moved out because that has become typical poverty neighborhood in Nanjing, and nobody wants to live there if they have the capability to move out. So it's quite miserable. So I heard that it's still stuck in the middle of redevelopment because of some arguments between the indigenous residents and the government. They could not reach a deal to convince them to move out. So basically, it's still stuck in a very poor and deprived stage. I would really like to know what is going on there and what could be the potential solutions. Yeah, it's correct. Actually sad to hear that they remain the same situation. It's like the forgotten place. Yeah. Another thing I would like to say is don't forget those smaller cities, because Nanjing, although it's not, it's already being overshadowed by Shanghai, but there are many other much smaller or ordinary cities that in China that worth our attention, especially those in the inland area, in the western region. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that we've got a Eastern bias on Chinese?
Yeah. Probably the Western understanding about Chinese is all based on the coastal or eastern cities. Yeah, but of course, some other people have written about Tibet, or Xinjiang, or Yunnan, but those are all quite unique cases. So probably we should know more about those in the inland, in the middle. Smaller cities, smaller inland cities.
We're missing the middle.
Yeah.
Pretty big middle.
Yes.
It's a nearly billion people middle, so it's not a small middle, not too.
Yeah.
Right, back in the studio of the dog park. What's your main takeaway, Caitlin?
So there's so much to take away from what we've just had from Shenjing, but I'll focus on 2 points. The first, I think, is Shenjing's encouragement for urban researchers researching perhaps from the Chinese vantage point to pay attention to the ordinary cities and not always focus on the Shanghais and Beijings, which is precisely how we opened up this episode. And the second thing I heard from Shenjing was the encouragement for us to think about the process of urbanization in general as not being unique or exceptional in China, but being a general process that has unfolded in China, but at a much, much faster pace. And what I thought Shenjing said that was really interesting was to think of Chinese urbanization as a time-space compression. So what happens in the US or some European cities over the space of 100 years has happened in China over the space of a decade. And I just thought that was such a clear and compelling way of framing urbanization in China in a way that isn't exceptional, but puts it in relation to urbanization in other places.
Yeah, I quite like actually that there's so many elements in there that are portable, not being a Chinese urbanism specialist, that I sort of really take away some bits about the enterprising self and the speculative city. And I quite liked the reflection on the Eastern bias and the presence of particular cities in the Chinese urbanism imaginary out there, which to me takes me a little to the episode with Dallas Rogers and the decisions of the Chinese boardrooms that define Sydney, but also on that sort of traveling comparisons that Judy Wren was talking about in her episode. And with that, there you have it, Shenjing He, with a teaser of her work on the enterprising self and speculation in Chinese urbanism.
If you want to read and hear more about Shenjing's work in urban studies, do take a peek through our show notes for some links and dive in.
So until next time, thanks for listening. Thanks for walking the city, or the dog park in this case, with us and with Shenjing. See you next time. Walking the City With is a mini-series by the Urban Studies Journal with the University of Bristol and the University of Melbourne, produced by Caitlin Morrissey in Manchester, Julia Macbeth in Glasgow, Kate Murray in Melbourne, and myself, Michele Acuto, in Bristol. Thank you for listening.